All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. In this episode, our guest is Tommy Stevenson. Tommy was the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the independent online student media company, Cougar Chronicle. Welcome to the show, Tommy.
Good to be here, Greg. Thanks for having me.
All right, I'm excited about this episode. I want to pull your experience, information that you have in going to BYU. You just recently graduated. Get some firsthand accounts of your experiences at BYU in dealing with, let's call it the religion of academia, and your overall feel for what's happening at BYU as compared to other universities. I wanted to start off talking about the Cougar Chronicle itself. What was your overall goal with the Cougar Chronicle? Because it kind of acted to some degree as a check and balance to what doesn't exist anywhere else at BYU of looking at some of these issues on campus.
Yeah. So when we, formerly BYU Conservatives, the Instagram page, me and Luke, he's been on the podcast before, we took it over. And as we had some growing numbers in audience, it was around 14 or 1,200 when I was thinking about doing this. Whenever I saw a Daily Universe article that was somewhat political, it tended to lean left on the angle. Most of the universe isn't political in terms of their publishing. And then there's also the Prodigal Press, which is the independent left-wing newspaper in Provo. And they split off of the universe a while ago. And I said, hey, there's not really a conservative voice for publishing, for reporting on things that are happening at BYU. And I said, hey, to our audience at the time with BYU Conservatives, what would you guys think about us starting a newspaper? And we got a lot of feedback that was positive, that people wanted it. And we said, okay. And it started out as something of a hobby. I mean, I wouldn't say we were nowhere near the content we put out now in terms of reporting or the quality of the reporting. And then the volleyball story happened. And that kind of gave us an extra push to say, hey, we have to keep up with this.
With Duke.
With Duke, yeah. And for those who haven't seen that, I would just look up BYU Duke volleyball story. You can say race, hoax, and everything on it will pop up. And that was basically the spark that lit the fire. And we've been growing ever since. And we've got like about a dozen or so students who work on it. And we've been keeping an eye on what's happening at BYU in terms of liberal and left-wing bias that I would say not so much liberal, like classically liberal, but ideologically left-wing and identitarianism, like you talk about a lot in the religion of academia, that really concepts that can be taught, I would say they should be taught in an objective sense, but that doesn't mean they can be conflated with gospel principles, especially at BYU.
So here's something that a lot of people question, right? They put this question out when I cover things on BYU. It's like, how do these things get into BYU, right? Why are these professors at BYU if they're wanting to teach something that's diametrically opposed to the gospel and opposed to the BYU mission, right? How are these professors there? And why do they feel the need to push this agenda with students so much?
I would just say it's part and parcel of academia writ large. And BYU, since it's in that space, gets infected with that at some point also. I mean, I worked for Campus Reform, and I don't speak for them at all. As I don't speak for them since I'm only their employee. But I did that alongside doing the Chronicle. And the things that happen at other universities are crazy in comparison to what happens at BYU. And just because higher academia professors, they go in the same circles, they have to publish on the same journals, they have to work together. Naturally speaking, professors, especially in the humanities and sociology, these types of fields, they talk to each other and share similar viewpoints. And that I think that's one of the main causes is that higher academia, just in general, is very left wing. Because if you did, I think the Deseret News put out this study, or it was a survey taken at BYU, that BYU is one of the most balanced politically, one of the most balanced universities in terms of politics in all of Utah. But everyone around the country,
which in some ways is a little bit surprising to begin with.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. In fact, I think that I saw that poll. I think it actually does still, in most cases, lean left, as I recall. But it was at least from the poll, but it's just a lot less than the other universities.
It's a lot less than other universities, especially when you're talking about faculty. And because of that, even because we're seen as one of the most conservative colleges in the whole country, but if we're super balanced or like balanced with our political views, then what does that say about the other universities around the whole country? Like I published, well, I didn't publish it. I wrote an article in Campus Reform about quant crit, which is critical race theory applied to statistics. And I haven't seen that at BYU, but other universities they're taking critical race theory and applying it on the back end of statistical models to push a certain conclusion. And they're basically calling into question the objectivity of numbers at that point, and merit and complete, like, straightforward reason, and applying critical theory and critical race theory to it. And there's plenty of other examples I could point to from different universities, but things like that, I think BYU's just kind of getting pulled along just as a result of being in higher academia. As they go further left, so does BYU. And so that's why we're seeing these things happen.
So the question is then, what does BYU do about that? Right? From a student's perspective, you see this going on, you've been in these classes, you see firsthand this ideology that's being pushed. How does BYU go along with their mission statement, still try to be a top university, and yet not have these types of pernicious ideologies taught to the students?
I would say, and I think I've written this in a message before to the communications department when I reached out for comment about a story. I basically think that BYU should become something of the next Hillsdale, because Hillsdale College is a classical liberal arts college. And it has very conservative professors, or like centrist professors, that are teaching just research that's been objectively measured, and not like quote unquote objectively measured, but Hillsdale, not in the religious sense, like don't become Hillsdale as like a secular school, but in terms of branding and in terms of what BYU needs to do to appeal to members of the church, I would say to become the next Hillsdale and to push just classic teaching within a gospel lens as well. And if you did that, I believe you'd actually appeal more to members, because members of the church, they tend to be more conservative. It's getting less and less at this point because of things that have been going on. But if they did that, I think it would bode much better for them in the long run.
So let's go into some of the specifics here of what you've seen. And, a lot of the stuff that you've seen, we've covered actually on the podcast here. But some of the specifics, you have the family sciences, eternal family class recently, a teacher talking about the transgender kid and pushing transition. You have the whiteness activity you guys covered from another sociology professor. You have the, Kendi is being held up and put up on a pedestal for the entire Kennedy Center. There's all these things that are happening on the boots on the ground type things where students are directly in front of these professors learning about all of these things. when you came to BYU, did you expect this? What did you first feel when you started seeing some of these things? And then, of course, how have you reacted since then?
So I didn't expect it per se at BYU, like to the degree that I've seen. I guess I've been involved in politics since high school, and I actually never thought I would go directly into politics out of college. I always thought I was going to do business and have a career in that, and then maybe do stuff with it later in life. But I've always had an interest in it, and as a result of the last year or so, that's kind of where I'm going at this point. But I always knew that higher academia was somewhat left leaning. And I knew that there would be some professors who were, and not just left leaning as like classically liberal left leaning, but like hard leftist ideological viewpoints. And I did have a
race theory, gender ideology, all these identitarianism, all of these types of ideas.
Yeah. And I had a sociology class my freshman year, and I won't name the professor's name or anything, but that was there in spades. There was critical race theory being taught. I mean, critical race theory wasn't really as widely publicized at that point as a theory, but looking back, I can definitely say that those concepts, like Robin DiAngelo was taught. At one point, I had a conversation with the professor, and I asked her how, because there's studies that show that like primates, monkey, like this is having to do with gender, that boy monkeys play with boys' toys and girl monkeys will play with girls' toys, just as a general rule, percentage majority. And I asked her, how do you explain that when you say that gender is a social construct? And she literally straight-faced told me that it's because that the scientists socialized the monkeys that way. So there's a few more examples from that class that I won't go into, but I didn't expect it to be that bad. And because of that and other things that I've seen at BYU, I just became very aware of specific ideological viewpoints that were being pushed as if they were in line with the gospel when they're not. And that is really what got me.
Okay. And as you saw, give some examples of some of these other things that you saw. You say you had the experience with a sociology professor in your freshman year. What other things have you seen? Tell me about the whiteness activity. We've covered that already, but tell me about this whiteness activity that this professor did assign her students.
Yeah. So the whiteness activity, it came from the same professor that I had freshman year, but it basically said on the whiteness activity that whiteness, and this is Robin DiAngelo talk. This is from her books. She wrote White Fragility, which is a terrible, it's like non-scientific whatsoever. It basically says that if white people complain about anything having to do with race, then that makes them racist. Like if you're saying that you're not a racist, you're still a racist. If white tears, like if you are in a diversity, equity.
It's the original sin. I mean, if you're white, you have original sin.
Exactly. And that's what her whole shtick is. Mm-hmm. So the whiteness activity quoted a bunch from her books and then said, in order to go find whiteness, go take pictures on campus take pictures of things on campus that represent whiteness. So basically go take pictures of things on campus that represent racism. And someone brought this to us. We got it from two sources, actually. A couple of people sent it to us because it had already been circulating, and we posted it. And then, I mean, this is public info now, but Eric Bybee messaged us. He was a different professor, but said that we had to take down the post because we were violating the honor code, which we weren't, it turns out. And that if he didn't take it down before the next morning, he would go personally to the honor code office president and report us to him because of copyright infringement. So we took down the post, but then we put it back up in paraphrase and took out, basically redacted his name out of the message he sent us, basically blackmailing us to take down the post, and said, this is what this professor is trying to do. He's trying to silence us just because we take issue with this assignment, which wasn't, and it wasn't like on the actual honor code, it says don't post things to third-party websites for, well, it doesn't say that specifically. It says you need to be academically honest. And the third-party websites that Bybee talked about in his, because he made a Twitter thread and everything after this, there's stuff like Chegg, Quizlet, other academic related websites, which are websites designated to study. So we weren't posting it to study from. It wasn't a filled out assignment. It was an in-class activity.
Yeah, these are outlets to help students cheat, basically.
Yeah. And that was, and the part of the honor code which he cited was the teacher resources to take down material that has been posted to third-party websites. But the honor code didn't have that verbiage, and it basically just says to be academically honest. And so he tried to, and then he made a whole Twitter thread. It went semi-viral. And I ended up going to the dean, and I actually said, I don't know if this was because he eventually took down the Twitter thread. And I said, hey, we didn't break the honor code, and there's nothing in this that violates school policy. And we went to the copyright office, Luke did, and we had a phone call with them. They basically said, yeah, if a teacher has a problem with this, I see this as fair use, which is fair use law is basically you can take some published material to make commentary on it, which we were. And they saw it as fair use at BYU. And I said, if we suffer damages from this, then we have reason to legally sue. So that didn't end up happening. And Bybee eventually took the tweet down. And that's basically how that all went. And Campus Reform got wind of it. And that's kind of how I got on their radar. And it was kind of a mess of a situation, but
it's just so interesting. There's so many stories that come out on universities, and that was one of the first ones that really kind of went national with BYU about these types of things. And I think a lot of people outside of the LDS community were shocked. It's like, wait a minute, this is at BYU? Where are we at with academia if this is actually now happening at BYU? And so that's the feedback that I got from a number of people. And I always think about that whiteness activity. I mean, imagine you're sending out your students on campus to look for whiteness. And I always tell people, you know what? I just want you to think about this for a second. Replace whiteness with Jewishness. And imagine someone telling you to go out and try and look for Jewishness or Jewish things, out that would have Jewish behavior of some sort. It's disgusting. It is absolutely disgusting. It is against gospel principles. It is not Christ-like. And
it's just races or ethnicities. That's basically how
it's horrible. It's horrible that this is the type of thing that is happening out there. I wanted to ask you, do you think that there are obviously, not all professors are obviously like this at BYU, but the ones that are, and they definitely are very self-promotional, I would even say, in who they are and what they're trying to push. Would you say that most of their students are looking for them and they want to be in those classes? And so the bulk of the students are already kind of bought into these ideologies and they want to, that's where they want to go. And so they choose these professors, or is it a little bit more random?
I would say in lower level classes, it's more random. But as you get into higher level classes, then it's definitely specifically chosen. And I mean that specifically after you've chosen your major, after you've determined kind of where you want to go, and you've already got a sense with this about what you want to do, in terms of your schooling. But I don't think freshman year I don't think, and I know I've been rather politically involved, but I don't think most people freshman year are like, okay, who do I go see that's a conservative or liberal professor? Like that's not something that I think crosses a lot of people's minds
Mm-hmm.
unless they're actually very politically active. And I tend to think that you get more. I don't mean maybe it's just because my school wasn't super political until I was like a senior in high school or so. Maybe it's different now. I think it is kind of just judging from what I see on the news, like how many elementary through high schools have been more politicized. But I don't think that crosses people's minds just as a general rule.
What do you feel that these professors that are pushing these ideologies, do you feel that they're pushing a different religion?
I would religion and a different religion in essence, I would say yes. But I wouldn't want to say that they aren't true. Because I do think that there's people who because the hard left is very good at this, that they take words that are supposed to be good and then turn them into words that are connotatively giving you just a taste of identitarianism. Things like diversity, equity, inclusion are perfect examples. Anti-racist. It's like, who doesn't want to be anti-racist? It's like, well, if you make the book saying that you want to discriminate against people to be anti-racist, then yeah, I don't want to be your type of anti-racist, which is Kendi. But I think that people don't really see that upfront as much. Conservatives aren't really good at that. But I would say that the hard left is. And but I don't want to say that people are I wouldn't say that people are just ignorant about it until they actually have gone into it. But by that point, I think some people just become somewhat obsessed with that point of view.
Well, they convert to some degree, right? Yeah. I mean, you convert to a new worldview is what I think ends up happening.
Yeah, you're trying to push a circular peg in a square hole.
Yeah.
When you're
trying That's a good way to put it. Yeah, I think
when you're trying to teach like identitarianism as the gospel, that's what you're trying to do at core, but people don't necessarily recognize that on the surface.
That's the biggest concern I have at BYU, more than anything else. Look, I don't care. You could teach Marxism all night long, or all day long at BYU. I think that it should be taught in elementary schools. I think it should be taught in high schools, and we should talk about the horrific disasters and results of what happened in the 20th century. Fine, go teach it. Wonderful. The difference is that what you're doing at BYU, at a place like BYU, which is a religious school, is you're trying to take gender ideology, you're trying to take all of identitarianism and intersectionality and critical race theory and all of these ideas, these ideologies, and you're trying to conflate them with the gospel and say, well, these are all the gospel. This is all the gospel of Jesus Christ. Critical race theory is the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Right. That is the concern. And you can see this all over the teachings and the writings and the videos that I've seen of all these professors where they've taken all of this ideology and packaged it into this gospel idea. It's kind of like the genderless Jesus, right? Where the professor puts up the image of Jesus, who now represents everything that is non-binary. Right. All fluidity of gender is represented by Jesus Christ because he's non-binary and he's anything you want him to be.
Yeah.
So this conflation is more of a concern to me than teaching any of these things.
Yeah. And we've seen that specific diagram, like the different like feminine, masculine terms to show that Christ was genderless, which is oh my gosh, in different classes. We haven't necessarily reported on all of them, but we have, like, we don't publish everything that we know about because there would be too much. And also not everything can be verified, but I've definitely seen those specific slides in that class that you talked about in different classes also. So
Okay.
it's not just, I would say that it's a minority of classes that teach this
Yes.
type of stuff as gospel truth,
Mhm.
but it's not just a minute.
It's not just a handful of professors.
Yeah.
No, yeah, it's not. Now, what about, one of the things one of the individuals I much focus on is Ibram X. Kendi. He is kind of the icon of anti-racism. He's one of the most sourced and scholars, I'm putting air quotes up here, in academia. The Kennedy Center, as an example, put him in during the COVID years. He was the assignment for all those in the Kennedy Center was to read How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. And then they brought the professors on video and did Zooms and they're just expounding on how incredible Ibram X. Kendi is and what he teaches. Why is it that I mean, that's not just a couple of professors, right? That is I don't know what the Kennedy Center would be considered. It's an institution there, or it's department wide, whatever it is. But it's not just at a class level even that these things are happening. It's much broader than that.
It was the book of the semester.
Yeah, it was the book for the semester, the assigned book for the semester, and all positive response from the faculty on Ibram Kendi. What does that tell us about at least pockets of BYU?
It tells us either people don't understand what the core facets of Kendi are, or that they are knowingly in direct contradiction with principles of the gospel. Those are the only two.
These are highly intelligent professors. It's hard for me to think that it's the former of those two.
Yeah. No, I know.
I mean, I know we want to give the benefit of the doubt, right? But it's like, when you're advocating for these things, it's not just, hey, this is positive, this was great. It's they're actually advocating for pushing this ideology.
And the thing is that, and we had a clip about this, I know it's online somewhere, but Kendi has literally said that missionary work basically is racist. You can look up liberation theology versus savior theology, Ibram X. Kendi. Maybe you could link it in the description. But Kendi sits on the stage and talks about how theology and religion can play into how to be an anti-racist. And he says that savior theology, I think he literally says, it's going out and saving people, like saving their souls. But that is racist theology. And that's literally what the church does all over in every country. Well, not every country, but all around the world. But that liberation theology, or that Christ came to liberate everyone from the oppressors that be in their space of time, that is anti-racist. That Christ didn't come to save you from your sins, but instead came to save you from your oppression of others, or save you from oppression given to you by others. So that's Kendi straight on the stage.
And it's not just I mean, if you read his books, his two most popular books, which is Stamped from the Beginning and How to Be an Anti-Racist, when you read his books from the very beginning, this is right at the onset of both books, he goes into this. This is his basis for his anti-racism, right? His parents grew up with this liberation theology. He delved into it. Essentially, he says that if you believe in Gethsemane and the cross, you're a racist. That's essentially what he's saying. It goes so far against the core of the gospel. And yet here you have all of these professors and department heads that are putting him up on a pedestal and almost worshiping him. I'm telling you, you should see these videos of how they advocate for him.
They've compared
and his tenets.
Like I think it's Professor Gabriel. I think he's I don't quote me on that, but I think that there are professors such as him that have compared him with President Nelson, like his words to root out racism. That you have to use Kendi, which, and we can go into the details about it, but the quote that everyone cites is that Kendi says you have to use present discrimination to fix past discrimination and future discrimination for present discrimination. To be anti-racist, that's what you have to do. And the page beforehand, and I'm pretty sure, I'm pretty sure I know the pages. It's like 17 and 18 or 18 and 19 of how to be an anti-racist because I've looked at it so many times. The page beforehand, Kendi goes in and says that equity, which is equality of outcome, and he says it's equality of outcome is when people are on proportional footing, like groups. So, and then gives the example of housing percentages, like home ownership, and says that if proportionally blacks have less home ownership than whites, then something racist occurred. Which I would say that things that are racist have occurred, but there's more factors that you're not taking into account. So why are you using just one factor analysis to do it all out? And the solution to fix that is discrimination to get equal outcomes. And that's literally those 2 pages. And it's flat out against everything the gospel stands for with agency and by choice. So
It's not just it's not anti-racism, it's anti-Christ.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah.
All right. So lastly, I want to go over this. You've had some experience with a lot of what's going on with other universities across the country. You've been at BYU, you just graduated. How would you compare what is happening at BYU with these woke ideologies as compared to the rest of the country?
I would say it's milk toast compared to other universities. Like teaching Kendi and then teaching gender ideology. Like there was a professor in Penn State that I covered that told his students that they were all bisexual and should go watch gay porn to find out about it. And that was a national story. It got attention from like places like the Daily Wire and Fox News and everything. But that's the type of stuff that happens at other universities. But it's the same ideological viewpoints that are being taught with gender theory and critical race theory. There was another university they invested around $40,000 into a Latino critical theory organization that, and they basically, the school didn't buy the property, but the organization bought a property, and then the years afterwards, the school gave them like $40,000, I think, twice. And on the property, they go and commune basically, and there's pictures of their Facebook of drinking and partying and stuff, and not really doing research. But there are a lot crazier things that happen than at BYU.
Would you say that BYU is simply behind the times a little bit on the
Yeah,
arc, and
I would say BYU is just behind. Yeah.
yeah, they're moving toward the same thing, but they're just behind the times a bit.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's the sense that I get as well. All right, Tommy, is there anything else you wanted to get in here, talk about before we conclude?
I did want to talk about the one story that I haven't talked about beforehand.
Okay.
This has to do with more gender theory, and it was in a class. Um, it was about a year and a half ago. I was invited to my wife's class, or they allowed me to come, the professor, and because that had happened before, and it was in reaction to a few things that had been happening with her in the class, some left-wing talking points. My wife that was talking about it, but when I got there, we started talking about gender theory and transgenderism. And in the middle of we were talking in groups, and in the middle of one of the group discussions, I started talking about the dangers of transgenderism for minors. And the professor interrupted me and said that I was spreading misinformation in her class, and then proceeded to kick me out after I said, I can show you all my sources, and I can show you why I'm talking about this specifically. But then she kicked me out of the class. And that was probably the number one thing that stuck in my mind of things that are happening at BYU.
So she's not willing to tolerate a diversity of opinion on the ideologies that she's trying to push, essentially, which is pretty typical, you know. So yeah. All right. Well, Tommy, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate the work that you've done. You and I have collaborated on a number of things. Good luck to you on your move toward politics and what you're trying to accomplish now. And thanks so much for sharing your information here with Cwic Show.
Awesome. Thanks, Greg.
All right.